Okay, we're back. And I once again have the same clothes on if you're watching. Okay, so the MP4s don't have my video in it, but there's a version that does. May switch over to. So the initial permutation, basically what you do is 16 identical rounds of applying this function over and over using the different 48-bit keys. So you're taking your input, and this is like shuffling a deck of cards. You do it once, and again, and again, and again, 16 times, and you get a 64-bit output. And this has to happen pretty fast, but it takes a little bit of time. So if you insist on using longer keys or more rounds, it takes a longer amount of time. And we'll talk about what happens when you insert your credit card in the card reader. So what's taking it so long? What's really happening? Why is that safer than swiping? Where's the wind going? I know where it's coming from, but where's it? How are we getting airflow in here? It's like bizarre. How is it moving? It's like one hole. How is it going in and out? Okay, I guess it's like opening a car window. It just happens. So you take the output from one and you run it through again as the input, the key for the next. And so you do this substitution. So these things are relatively sound. They're complicated. They're a lot more complicated than most people think. AES is a standard that replaced DES. So if you're still using DES, good luck. This one does 128-bit blocks, and you have several different lengths of key. So brute force decryption takes 1 second on DES, and they say it takes 149 trillion years on AES. Now what I'm going to do at this point is see if I can find a document. That's not at all. There we go. If this is a sheet, how can I find this? I'm going to have to go to Google Drive to find it. Let's see if I can find it in here. There we go. I'll have to share this. Just a little something else I stole off the internet. So this was where this came from originally. Let's see if I can open up the original website. So this is one of the more important articles I've ever read on Stack Exchange. And someone who knows what they're doing logged in and put an article together, sort of on the cuff, off the cuff, that shows what the decryption costs are. And so basically what this is showing is, based on the bit size of an algorithm that you're using and the number of machines that are available to you, how long would it take to get decryption done? So you can basically plug this in. And I lost the other most important article I ever found on this. So if you ever find it, please remember me in your career and send it to me, because I will probably still be looking for it. And it's one that basically looked at all of the encryption algorithms we use today and show how long it would take if you were to get some number of free trial AWS server accounts. How long would it take to decrypt? And basically, there's not a single one of them that's worth a penny, except for one that no one uses, because it's really would be super slow. Like you would have to wait 15 minutes for your credit card to clear, for example, and going through. So there's a totally different approach to security that I want to make sure you guys are aware of. And I have two examples to give you. One of them is a little bit of an old, well, I guess they're both a little bit of an old story. One of them has to do with Shell Oil, and the other one has to do with the New York diamond merchants market. So they used to ship diamonds to jewelry stores from New York, because that's where most of the diamonds came in and were cut. And so there was a small industry in New York that supplied most of the diamonds. And diamonds are a very interesting fake market. They're actually quite common stones, but they've controlled the market so well that they've been able to keep the price up for centuries. Anyway, this is an output of one of these sort of monopolistic behaviors. So how do you suppose they ship these diamonds around the United States to banks or to jewelry stores? How would you ship diamonds? Louder. In a secure truck, like an armored car? Okay, but remember what I told you, they're really actually plentiful. They don't really cost anything. The cost is all in the markup. It doesn't really, they're common. So if you lost one and it was at cost, no big deal. It's like losing a piece of glass or something. So what's another way you might, knowing that, how would you send them? Just the mail. They send them in the mail. They just put them in the mail. Yeah, they take them maybe to the downtown post office, and they don't maybe just leave them in the outbox sitting at the Diamond Merchant front desk or something, but they put them in the mail. Why is that safe? Because it's good. How are you going to find it? Good luck finding it. Now, this is perhaps not still the practice because there's much less mail volume now, but you are inheriting a different type of social security by doing that, because if somebody steals the mail from the mailman, they will be going to federal prison forever. They'll just squeeze you to dust. So you don't have to pay for that. The government will provide that for you. Just like eavesdropping on a phone call. If you get caught doing that, you will go to prison. Yeah, and besides, if you lose a couple now and then, you're going to do a cost trade-off. How often do you lose them? How much did you lose? How much did you save by sending them in the mail? It's pretty obvious, the answer. All right, I'm going to give you another example with JCPenney. And the reason I'm telling you these is these are practical security considerations that, if they're effective, are good enough. Right? They're good enough. Like you could steal all my money if you knew where I kept it. But if you don't know where I kept it, I could leave it in a jar. It doesn't have to have a lock on it. People, you hear these stories, they stick it into their mattress and stuff like that. Okay, Shell used, back up a little bit. Before we had the internet, we had lots of other approaches for sending data. There was a need to send data around the United States. And there was a shared network that was interconnected all over the planet. It was very low speed, and it was called X25. And it was built on a 64 kb per second channel, but actually subdivided it into 8, into 16, into 4K, etc. And if you wanted to connect to this network, you would run a circuit from your premise to the phone company, and you would give them instructions on where the packets needed to be sent. And they would program their equipment to do that. But they would have a label on the packet that would help them get it there, but the infrastructure was shared by everyone. So there was one X25 network in Houston, for example, and everyone's packets went over, and the phone company controlled it. So they were why you could be confident that your packets wouldn't be seen by anyone else. It took a physical configuration of equipment to send them someplace. So nothing was looking at the idea and making a decision on the fly. It was a way of sharing the bandwidth, but it was done in a more secure fashion. Very low bandwidth, and it still exists. Some things still use it. So people that needed to send just a little bit of data would use this. So for example, JCPenney's would use this to connect their stores to handle their credit card authorizations. So all of their stores would connect to the local X25 network, and then all these carriers would connect their networks together, and they could get the packets up to Dallas, where they're headquartered, and there they would have a connection to Visa and to MasterCard. That was an expensive connection, and they would hand the credit card number over and get an authorization back, and they could do this kind of in real time. I still remember when I was a kid going to the grocery store, if we used a credit card, the person had a little tiny phone book that was sent to the grocery store every week, and they would thumb through to get to your number to see if it was valid or not. Can you imagine that? I mean, this was in the 70s. This was not that long ago. So they would publish a list of stolen credit card numbers and mail them out. It's like, really? It was crazy. So JCPenney's, it turns out, became quickly one of the largest data network providers in the United States, because what they did to try and share cost was they rented space. They set up a company They got really good at doing this, and they sold these services to other businesses. Like, would you like to also do this with data? We will build it for you. We will manage it. We know all the people at the phone company, all the paperwork to fill out. They know us. We can get stuff done faster than you, cheaper than you. And it's a huge pain in the butt. We'll manage it for you. And they were very successful at doing this. And in fact, Shell Oil connected all of their gas stations, all 30-something thousand, through the JCPenney network. And so did a lot of other companies. So they were good at getting this stuff done. So the problem is it's slow. So you walk up to a pump at a Shell station, and you take out your credit card, and you run the card through, and it would take 15 seconds to get the approval back. Now, when they're bagging your clothes up and they're putting things in and chatting with you and asking you about the coupons, and they can kill 15 seconds at the counter at the JCPenney store. But what are they going to do with you at the pump? So you swipe it, and until you have the authorization come back, the system inside the station would not turn the gas pump on. So this is a big problem. So Shell decided just to turn them on anyway. You swipe your card, and you turn on the pump. So I want you to walk me through how that's not insane. And it isn't. So how would you approach that problem if you're the network manager? What would you do if I told you it took 15 seconds? Why would they say just turn it on anyway? And so what would happen? Like, let's say that 15 seconds, they get 15 seconds of gas. What's going to happen most of the time? The authorization, they're going to be approved. The authorization will come back. You just keep pumping. So you can do the math on cutting people's visits down by 15 seconds times the number of pumps into the ratio of how long it normally takes them to gas up, and figure out how many more people you can get through your pumps that day. And sometimes it's okay to have people wait a little bit because they'll go buy something more, which is what the merchant wants. They make all their money inside the store. Shell makes all their money outside the store. But some people will drive away. So that's what you're trying to avoid. And if the card's stolen, what happens? They got 15 seconds worth of free gas. And then, maybe they figure out to keep doing that, but this was not advertised. This was a secret. So you don't turn the pump on instantly. You make it take a second or two to you whittle that down a little bit. And you also don't pump gas very fast. Anybody ever notice that? Yeah. So that's kind of irritating. So that's another security approach. Secure in plain sight. So you've got to be pragmatic about doing this. The reason why with the network it's more difficult is because lots more attackers from lots more remote places can get at you quickly. Okay, so public key was a radically different approach proposed by Ravish, Shamir, and Adelman. And this came out from MIT in 1978. And this one you have two keys. This is the two-key system that I talked to you about before. So Alice, in this case, has a message that she wants to send to Bob. So she's going to encrypt it with Bob's public key. So this is the opposite of what we talked about a minute ago. Alice wants to send it to Bob, and she wants to make sure only Bob can read it. Now, before, what was I doing? Before, I was sending a message out that I wanted everyone to know came really from me. But this is the opposite of that. This time, everyone can see the message, but I only want Bob to be able to tell what I'm saying. So I don't worry about making the message secure. I send this encrypted message over the internet, and it's been encrypted with Bob's public key. When Bob receives it, only he has his private key. If he loses his private key, he's got to generate another pair of keys. But the world doesn't end. He just generates another pair of keys and republishes a new public key instantly. And where do you store these public keys? At certificate authorities, like the one we pulled up a few minutes ago at Amazon, for example. So if the math is good, then when I've encrypted this message to Bob, my message, with Bob's public key, he uses his private key and he gets the message back. So this public and private pair will give you back the message. And it works in reverse as well. which is sort of mind-blowing. If you reverse this process and Bob sends something back to Alice, Bob is going to want to encrypt it with his private key, throw it out on the internet, everybody can see it, and they know it came from Bob because his public key and only his public key decrypts it. So if anybody sees this message and they try and it says it's from Bob, they can tell. They can use Bob's public key and they go, well, what do you know? It is from Bob. So is this enough? Is this good enough? I mean, Alice is okay that nobody can read the message she's sending to Bob, but when Bob responds, everyone can read it. And all they know is that it really came from him. Furthermore, how does Bob know that this message that he got from Alice really came from her? All he knows is he got a message that was encrypted with his public key. So he knows it was for him, but he doesn't know who it came from. So that's a different problem. So what if instead of doing this, what if we did something different? Let me see if they have a diagram. They don't. They took it out on this one. So I'm going to erase instead. Let's go back to the first example we used. Suppose I want to send a message from Alice, and Alice wants to make sure that Bob is very confident that it's her telling him what to do. You know, it's not your neighbor playing a trick on you. It's really me. I'm really telling you to do this. Well, how can Bob be sure? Well, she can encrypt it with her private key. So Alice's private key will encrypt her message, and she sends it out over the internet. And when Bob takes Alice's, A for Alice, public key and uses it to decrypt the message that was previously encrypted with Alice's private key, he will get the message back. So now what does Bob know? Bob knows it really came from Alice, but so does everybody else. Everybody sees this message from Alice. Everybody can decrypt it with her public key. Everybody knows she sent a message. So what are we going to do? So what if you combine these things? What if you take your message and first you encrypt it with your public, it's very important I not screw this up. Suppose first you encrypt it with your own private key. You're going to get some string out of that. So let's say this string is your input to a second function. It's just a string. This function doesn't care where the string came from. It's just a string. Let's feed it to Bob's public key. And let's throw it out on the internet. Okay? Who can see it? Everyone. What can they do with it? They can see that it's a message from Alice to Bob, if you want to disclose that. If you pass it through a third party that emits it for you, maybe you don't. But you see it comes from Alice to Bob. What can you do with this thing? Well, you could encrypt it. You could decrypt it with Bob's private key, but you don't have Bob's private key. So can't do that. You can decrypt it with Alice's public key. That's publicly available. But it's not going to do you any good because it's been also encrypted with Bob's key, so you need his private. You can't do this. So what's Bob going to do with this thing? First of all, to undo this, what will he do? He will use his private key because we know that a message that was encrypted with his public key, this will undo the encryption. These cancel each other out. What am I left with? I'm left with a message that was encrypted with Alice's private key. What can I do to this? I can use Alice's public key to decrypt. These two cancel out. What am I left with? This revolutionized the industry, as you can imagine. You know who sent it. You know it's only going to the intended recipient, and it's secure. So this went great until about 20 years later, and these guys became famous. I mean, they became super wealthy. They started a company called RSA. Anybody ever heard of them? Yeah, so this was named after them. This sort of took over the way encryption was done everywhere on Earth. They licensed the software to do it, et cetera. The paper is public. They built a good business around it. And then 20 years later, the guys that had really discovered it first for the British Military Intelligence Organization were finally given permission to declassify their work, and they said, we did it first. And it must have been excruciating for them to watch these guys get rich and famous off of it, but they're because they have public health care and a good pension. They didn't really care. They're okay. But they invented it first. They just kept it secret. Don't underestimate the British and cryptography. If you don't believe me, go watch The Enigma, this movie about the Enigma machine. So for some reason, they have a culture that makes them really good at cracking numbers. So that's basically what RSA is about. The paper is deeper at going through what's happening, but essentially this will sound familiar with the CRC code that we did. If you take a number x and you take the remainder when you divide it by a number n, then the remainder of x when you divide it by n, that's what x mod n is. So if I take 25 mod 4, that's going to give me, what, 6 times 7 times 6 times 4 is 24. The remainder is 1. So I'm going to get a 1 out of that. So A mod n plus B mod n is the same thing as A plus B mod n. You also have a couple of other interesting properties. And so what you basically get to is that A mod n to the power of D mod n again is the same thing as A to the power of D mod n. So you can run through some examples. So what these guys found is if you pump very large prime numbers and factor that are difficult to factor, we're talking like 100-digit long prime numbers, and use a pair of them as your A and as your B in these kinds of examples, it's even if you know what one of them is, it's impossible to get the other one out because you run it through this pattern. So here's an example. Here's a message. It's uniquely represented by the decimal number 145. So to encrypt it, we're going to encrypt the numbers. So we'll encrypt, here's P and Q, 2 large prime numbers, and it's such that if you multiply them together, you get this number N. All right? So, and we're going to make these super large numbers, 1,024 bits apiece, 100-digit long, prime numbers. And we happen to know that Z is equal to P minus 1 times Q minus 1. So we're going to choose this variable E that's small so that it has no common factors so that they're relatively prime to each other. So you can't do it. And what you'll find is you can choose a D in such a way that you can publish these two and you'll end up with a private public key. We will not go through writing code. The only way to understand this is to actually code it. I'm convinced. I could sit here and talk for an hour through about it in detail, and there's just, for a computer scientist, there's no substitution, or at least writing an Excel spreadsheet, writing the function out some way or the other. So the book, I think there's an exercise. They have us do a couple of small ones with very small numbers that will give you basically the idea, but we've gone well beyond this at this point, including taking things like this and running them in sequences and patterns. So they kind of gave us an example in here, but I think it's mind-numbing to kind of try to walk through this thing. I think I'd rather give you the problem because you have to learn this at your own speed, and I will lose half the people at some point along the way, usually myself included. So what they've done is they picked some intentionally very small numbers here and show that you can take this and do C to the D and actually get this out. One of the things I want you to notice is that when you use algorithms like this, you want the length of the encrypted string also not to be a pattern. So for example, if you send a short message and you get a short string out, and then you send a long message and you get a long string out, people know when you're sending short messages and long messages. So in the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we thought the Soviet Union and the United States were going to have nuclear war over each other, one way we monitored what was going on and knew that the Soviets were getting ready was we just counted the number of messages. We just looked at the chatter, the frequency and the number of messages that were coming from their embassies and going to their field. And you can't understand any of it. It's encrypted, but you could see how much of it there was. And you can see patterns based on that and then make decisions. So a little bit more through this. Another important property, that we talked about already is that you can reverse the order of these things, but we already talked about that, right? So we already did that. And modular arithmetic allows you to kind of get that stuff. So in practice, you have these session keys. DES is 100 times faster than RSA, but you'll use this to establish a secure connection, and then you'll layer DES in to actually do the transactions in the middle. So the device at Target that you stick your credit card in can have an RSA session over the internet with the Visa clearinghouse that's processing Target's transactions in Milwaukee. And for your credit card can have a public key that it advertises when you stick the thing in, and it sends a request for a transaction, and it knows Visa's public key, can ask for that, and the only way the message is going to be decrypted that will be received successfully is if the public and private key match up. So when you stick the card in and it tries to send your credit card number to the bank, if it encrypts it first with your private key on the card in that chip, then they know what to sort of expect, and if they can decrypt it, then they know the card's real, for example. So you can use combinations, not necessarily in that pattern, but you can use combinations. You'll also use this for like ATM machines. So people have portable ATM machines that they'll set up like at a golf tournament. They'll wheel them out. They have a cellular connection. They'll put cash in them and stuff because there's like 1 million more people than normal at the golf course for the Masters or whatever. And they'll use encryption to go over a public network that way. Other business rules that make sense with this stuff, with Oracle Financials, one of the things you'll do is you'll encrypt, but you'll also make sure the data is stored in 2 places, in 2 different data centers, in 2 geographically dispersed areas. And to give you an idea of how poor of a job some people do and how important it is not to do a poor job at this, lots of people put data centers in Dallas. Not a lot of people put them in Houston because of hurricanes and flooding. But I was responsible for selling space in AT&T's data centers for a while. I had the data centers. And one of the things that we did, we tried to commission the study. We tried to find somebody who had done this already. Nobody had ever done it, which was mind-blowing. Then we tried to commission the study, pay someone to do it. Nobody wanted to do it, so we just ended up doing it ourselves. We took a map of Dallas, and people put both data centers in Dallas. So they would put a primary and a backup. And the reason why you don't put the other one in a remote location is it's more likely that you will lose connectivity. The network will get dug up, or it takes too long. It takes too many milliseconds to get something there. So people would usually put pairs of data centers in the same metropolitan area. So we started looking at where these things were. And then I went to the National Weather Service and pulled data for the last 50 years of tornadoes in Dallas, and we plotted them. And they would start here and end here. Most tornadoes, I knew this from growing up in Oklahoma, go to the northeast. That's just the path that they travel in this hemisphere. And so some of them go a short way, some of them go a very long way, but I'm only interested in the line segment that is strong enough to rip the roof off the data center. That's the first thing to go. And so we pulled the engineering permits that all of these guys had to file. It's public record. They had to file with the city to get their plans approved for construction, and we looked at their roof strength, and we hired an engineer to kind of tell us the speed really that it would take to rip the roof off. And it was usually about 70 miles an hour. And so these people would build data centers with like 2 feet thick concrete walls and then a roof made out of tar paper. 100% of the time. Every single one of them. People that didn't built bunkers. That's the difference. Galveston County has a bunker with a concrete roof that will not be pulled off. But most people didn't. So the reason why I looked at these segments is I wanted to figure out at the point from when the tornado first became strong enough to the point where it was last strong enough, it may have continued on as a weaker one, whose data centers are in sort of path. So we did a statistical distribution of how long this line segment is on average, and we lined people's data centers up, and we figured out, excuse me, who was vulnerable. And there were a lot of people that were. Then we looked at the FAA published flight approaches for the airports in the area. And we found that Sprint had a data center that was in the flight path for the dominant arrival path for heavy planes at DFW Airport. And we looked at crash data and figured out what these odds were, and it's higher the closer you get to the runway. Most people make it almost there. Unless it's random, the other class of them are the ones who get there. And we looked at how far away they were, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so we were able to show a business, you're looking for 5 nines uptime? Okay, well, they're running a 3 nines data center, and here's the document to prove it. And so we just like cleaned up. We won business using these types of arguments. But, you know, as a network manager, nobody had done this. I decided we needed to do this. It was responsibility. So you can't just focus money, politics, and religion. Remember, you can't just focus on the technology parts of it and ignore everything else. Nobody else was looking at this. The construction guys, like I built all the other buildings. Like, what are you talking? You told me where to build it. I didn't pick the land to do that. So you can get deceived sometimes. Despite doing all this right, your network will still go down. We had a bank in downtown San Francisco that the weekend had been closed as one of the tenants was having a new air conditioning compressor put on the roof of the skyscraper. So there was a Sikorsky crane helicopter. They closed the streets around it and closed the building and stuff. And this thing was flying the thing in to put it on the roof because they were putting some more equipment in the building. And they needed additional air conditioning capacity, and the landlord couldn't provide it. And the helicopter crashed on the roof of the building, and it was kind of hanging on the edge. Part of it was hanging over. Not enough to fall off, but there was a strong breeze. So they closed all the streets around it. 9 o'clock came. The bank vault clicked open, like it always does, for business. All the phones were working fine. There was no problem with the network. Packets were flying around, but nothing was getting done because no one had physical access to the facility. 99% of the time, the problem is physical access. The roads are frozen, the person doesn't show up to work, you run out of diesel fuel, whatever it might be. So when you design these secure things, you have to have ways of dealing with all of that stuff. Okay, so we've been through the authentication discussion. We'll fly through this because we've talked about this already. Here's the slides to kind of back it up to prove that you can't really decrypt. There is a security hole in some of this stuff, in that you can still have some man in the middle that if you can get someone to use the wrong key, then supposedly you can detect this stuff. But it's tough. At the very least, you can get copies of all the messages and then start to work trying to crack it, if you want. Okay, digital signatures are a technique for handwritten signatures that they're verifiable and non-forgeable. The most clever system I've ever seen to do this was one that was created by Bell Labs, and it was not when I worked there. It was I had worked there. I guess it was at a break or something. They would, and this is a little bit like blockchain. So they would take a message that you submitted, and they would run it through a cryptographic algorithm that depended both on a key and the output from the previous person to have done this. And the output from the previous person to have done this was itself a result of the key and the output of the previous person to them, which was, of course, the output from the previous person to them. So it was a chain of messages. And depending on what you submitted and when you submitted it would determine the output. So you would remember this, you would keep this key, and at the end of every day, they would publish in the New York Times Personals the last number of the day. So it was in a publicly verifiable space. It was believed to be impossible for someone to go around and obliterate every copy of the New York Times on Earth that day and change the number. So if you needed to go to court and prove that you had done something, you show up with your document. It was your responsibility to maintain the integrity of that document, not let a single bit change. And you would show up with that in this key, in the previous day's key, and you could show it as New York Times, so the judge would believe you. And the only way to get the end key out was to start with the beginning key, and your document would be the missing piece, and it would produce the same result. So you could prove that your document had not been changed and it existed on that day. in that fashion. So it was the most clever version. Blockchain does something similar. They chain these things together where it's very difficult to corrupt everybody who's keeping track of these strings. So these are pretty clever. They work well. We've already talked about hash functions, many to one, like a fingerprint or a password. And they basically talk different input messages, but identical checksums here, for example. Right? These things are changed around. This is like different passwords that give the same hash function as well. You can sign your messages with these things and have some more confidence. There are standards published for the type of hash functions that you use. SHA-1 is weak, but SHA-256 is stronger, and you can have these holes. There's a business and industry that's been set up to store these keys that we all trust. VeriSign is one of them, for example. You may have seen VeriSign. They lost control of their key database, and Dan Bonet ridiculed them on one of his videos. I loved it. It was awesome. But they had to basically regenerate every single key on Earth for every single customer that they had. And, of course, they lose a lot of business when that happens. People are like, what are you doing over there? What are you clowns up to? Like, are you going to lose it and not know it? How long did it take you to find that out? And so during that time, people can promulgate a fake key and they can generate it, the right one. So these are called certificate authorities. And Amazon obviously is one now. But basically you can look these things up. I don't know what I did to this slide. I'm sorry. So you can apply the certificate, but it's this combination of keys again that we look at. So we've been through this. We'll fly through a couple of things. Email is the same kind of idea. You can use these types of keys to encode privacy. Email servers are supposed to do this now. They're supposed to use this to prevent people from infiltrating. DNS servers are supposed to do this now as well. Routers are supposed to do this to exchange routes with each other. But this stuff is all detailed. What's more important, I think, for you to try to remember is the philosophy that you need to stay on top of this stuff. And it's interesting to watch the way the internet polices this. What they try to do is deny service to people who don't. So this is what Yahoo did to U of H. By U of H not keeping enough control of its email servers, that people were marking lots of our messages as spam, they basically stopped handling email for U of H. And that's effective. We whine about it and put a banner up, Yahoo mishandling email. Well, no, they're not. No, they're not. We're mishandling email. They didn't make it up. So when we get off of our arrogant position and we actually listen and do something about it, then maybe they'll stop policing our email that way. Maybe they're really harsh. Maybe we don't like how fast they did it. Whatever. But they're just keeping score. They're the referee. People marking our messages as spam. That's the root cause. So there's blacklist companies that keep track of this stuff, and they will feed you sites to your email server of people who have been known to send a lot of spam. So there's companies that try to get you to share your spam markings with them. So if you are Microsoft, you can make money by selling the spam markings to a third party. And they will build rules to try to spot it, and they will add you to a blacklist, and it's what it's called. And you will ingest that all day long, every day, continuously, and just filter out all those emails. Just don't even let them into your site. Right, so that's all automated now. You guys did SSL already. We already looked at that. It is a very widely deployed model. The thing I want you to understand is it's a shim. It's a piece of application layer software that we run right underneath our app. So it's not part of TCP. It's not part of the 5 layers. It's its own. So if I send something out of port 80 out of this layer here, out of my browser, it's handed not to TCP. It's handed to another program called SSL or TLS. And this is just another program. So like any other program, if it wants to get something out on the network, it has to generate a port number. And the port number that it's going to use is also well known, but it's not 80. It's a different number. Now TCP will take this message, which has been encrypted, and send it to the other end. And when it arrives at the other end, at the server, it's going to knock on the door of a program that is listening on this port. And what program is listening on that port? SSL or TLS. And that program will look in there for a key that you've exchanged and will decrypt it and will hand the output back to the web server. It will just give it right over as if it had really arrived at port 80. So this is transparent to the app largely, but it's not an operating system service on systems unless somebody wants to install it that way. It's just another piece of code that you wrote because TCP didn't do it. So you implement whatever key exchange you want. It's similar to what we've talked about before. There's a handshake, key derivation, data transfer. There's like a master secret that you're supposed to keep here. But this stuff works. Do you see the similarities? That we're using keys. We can use a public authority to try to authenticate who we are, because otherwise you really would have to send data over that you don't want. There's a known method of attack called a toy sequence, where you just record and replay a sequence later. So if I record all the packets you're sending that were encrypted with your key, that's fine. I just remember them, and an hour later, drop them out on the internet again. The exact same packets. The same packets that caused the handshake to happen, the same ones that cause you to go to the website and order something, and just do it again. I can't change anything, but I can replay the entire thing. It's like playing a tape recording over the phone. How do you know it's not the original one? So you have to generate something unique with every connection to keep that from happening. It's a known vector of attack. So you have a hello, you have what's called the nonce in here, which is a way of kind of getting things going. SSL's got issues, and this book takes you through a few things in here. There's some things to do anti-tampering in here as well. And I know I'm just like flying through this stuff, but we may come back and visit a couple of these things, but I kind of want to get the concepts down. I don't think we'll need to, however. So here's SSL. I got the real data. I have the data fragment. I encrypt it, and then that's what gets sent over the connection to the other side. We've already talked about that. We just talked about it. You have your record format in here. You have an exchange, and you guys saw this in Wireshark, where you have the key exchanges that happen up front. Okay, I want to skip over a little bit of this stuff and go to wireless LANs. We've talked about VPNs already in other lectures, thank goodness. I want to see. I'm worried I've passed it. No, here we go. Okay, you'll use symmetric key encryption. You can use it on every connection to an access point, which is one way you cannot sniff other people's Wi-Fi packets. So we usually will enforce this. The one thing the book doesn't really talk about too much in here, and nobody does, is the encryption that's used on the public switch telephone network. So your cellular connections, do you ever wonder why people don't hack those? Why they never show up in your Wireshark? Those are the crown jewel for the phone company. If they lose access to that, they can lose millions of customers. So that type of encryption is regulated and encrypted at several different layers, starting with the fact that it's illegal for you to make a device that does it in a carefully controlled IMEIs. So there's some fun in that. But with regular old Wi-Fi, we can do blockchain type of streaming encryption. And it's the same thing, right? You basically, with WEP, you take it and you run it through a series of these patterns. You XOR in this particular case, and you accumulate the encrypted bits at the end to send across. So it can be done quickly. You can write custom hardware to do it. In fact, it's one of the harder ones, SHA-256. There's chips being made now that have SHA-256 algorithms built onto the chip. And hackers love them because you can just pass things and try to hard code decrypt what's going on the other way. So a nonce is a once-in-a-lifetime key that gets used. You can break this stuff. Most of this stuff is fragile and is broken. One of the interesting things that people are talking about is ways of using arcs to try and generate keys that are harder to crack, have them be not just vectors but actually be curves. The very last thing I'll show you in the last couple of minutes we've got is boxes that do this stuff. You can buy hardware that implements all of this stuff. One of them is a firewall. A firewall is usually something that will also support some type of encryption. All the firewall does is, just like the name would imply, it keeps bad stuff from getting through. So you teach it throughout the day, sites to get rid of. They usually will prohibit all incoming connections from the internet, and any connection that you have has to be initiated by you. TCP cares who started it. If I want to be able to exchange data with you and I have a private address and I have to go through that and I'm behind a firewall and all this other stuff, if I can initiate the connection out to you, then data can go both ways. The firewall will permit that. It sees that I initiated the connection. If the exact same thing tries to happen in reverse, it will not be allowed. It cannot initiate a connection with you. So remember Skype. If you want a phone call with somebody at Skype, both of you have to have a connection to the Skype server, because you can't start one the other way. Once it's there, Skype can tell the other person, hey, he's trying to reach you, and then you find a way to exchange data. And we've worked hard on finding ways of letting the connection now get back in through the firewall, and even though it's coming between two private addresses. There's ways to Skype to kind of at least step out of the way. Back to my Mac, back to my PC, all of these WebEx programs, Zoom, all of the types of tools that do this sort of thing. Dropbox, the same exact way. All of these things require that you initiate the connection from your client. So one thing you should think about when you're trying to build a secure network, like let's say you're using Internet of Things devices, Arduinos, Raspberry Pis, black little Beagle boards, etc., is you are going to have to initiate the connection out to the mothership. A good example is a line of routers called Meraki. Anybody ever heard of them? So Meraki routers are intended for smaller businesses, and it's completely managed by the cloud. And this is actually becoming super popular now, and it's being used for other kinds of devices as well. You take the thing out of the box, you plug it in, you give it some sort of internet connection, and it will reach out to the mothership at Meraki.com and register. And if you have a browser open to your panel and you say, I would like to add a device, it asks you to take your iPhone and scan the code on the back of the device. And if you want, you can peel it off then, so nobody else can scan it, or keep it physically secure. And then it'll ask you for the purchase order number. It will make sure you have access to the sales receipt as well, so you can steal the router. And it will add it to your network. And all of the updates, communication, 100% of everything is done remotely from the cloud. There's no way to log into the router. There's no console port. There's no way to do anything on it. It's completely managed. So all the config decisions are made through a secure portal. So if this device has something new firmware, new software, new setting that needs to happen, you have to wait for it to connect to you. You can't push anything to this device. So it's added a whole other layer of security. But the reason why they really did it at first was because they can now concentrate engineers at one location in San Francisco at their offices, and customers call in. If I called right now, I have a whole bunch of Meraki gear because I got it at crazy, like 90 off. If I call them, an engineer will answer the phone. Like when you call Apple support, it's answered by somebody who knows what they're doing. It's not a call screener. So they can keep the costs lower, and they can log in and help you and show you what's going on and follow along on the screen, etc. So it's amazing that way. Okay, guys, hopefully you got a little bit of a feel for this. As you know, security is an entire another course as well. You know, encryption. We may come back to a little bit more of this stuff, but that's enough to kind of get our arms around it. You get some idea on keys. Do take time to make sure you understand how public key encryption works. That's the RSA method. I'll give you a problem on it as well. You have a homework. You have an assignment due tonight or last night, right? Okay, the Socket Lab's due tonight. So there were a few people asking me questions I never got to answer because I felt like dirt over the weekend. If you ask me one and I didn't answer and you still have it, ask me again, and I will tell the TAs not to count that late. But you had to have gotten your foot in the door to at least have asked me something before. Okay, see you guys later. by everyone, and I apologize for that.